As the old saying goes, volume is king. And while I don't 100% agree with that, I do believe volume plays an important role on trying to figure out what fantasy running backs will really give us the most upside, or the safest floor. So let's take a look at the volume monsters at running back from 2022. Headliner Nation, this is one of my most popular videos every offseason, and I'm bringing it back in 2023 for another spin. And we're going to be diving into several volume categories today to take a look at, from an overall perspective, who some of the biggest volume monsters were from the running back position last year, and how did that translate to fantasy production. And even though we don't want any of these running backs to trim any of this volume for next year, you may need to trim some of your volume down below. Manscaped is back with another year with the headliner, so if you are in need of some summer manscaping, make sure you head over to their website, manscaped.com, and use code word headliners at checkout. You're gonna get 20% off your order and free shipping. And again, it's beach days, ladies and gentlemen. You want to be looking your very best, and Manscaped can help you do that. Our first stat, plain and simple, rushing attempts. And I only took a look at guys that had over 200 rushing attempts last season. So if you notice a guy like Jonathan Taylor is missing, that's because he didn't have 200 carries last season. But we're not using this as a predictive model. We're using this to take a look back and see if there's anything that stands out that we need to keep in mind when drafting this year. I think when you take a look at the number of rushing attempts last year, nothing really stands out at the top of the numbers. But when you start to go down the board, I think there's a couple of things to point out. When you take a look at guys like Walker, Etienne, and Pierce, all of their number of carries are down, but they were either hurt at some point or they were not the starters to begin the season. So taking a look at their number of carries per game down the stretch or for significant portions of the season last year may benefit you a little more. And then Austin Ekeler coming in dead last on this list with 204 carries. It's a little bit surprising to see that number around 200. Does it go up again this season? I think the biggest surprise at the top of the rushing yards is guys like Miles Sanders and Dalvin Cook. I don't think people realize how good of a season Miles Sanders had last year. And maybe it wasn't high output numbers every single week that allowed you to be super faithful in his consistency, but he still had a good season. And even though he loses Philadelphia's offensive line, his situation in Carolina isn't going to be horrible either. Everyone is sitting around right now waiting to see if Dalvin Cook is released. He still has more than enough juice. If the Vikings really want to move on from him, which I believe would be a massive mistake, I guarantee there's going to be some teams ready to jump in. I think we can all agree that 815 yards from Joe Mixon last year was terrible, and we hope that he bounces back this season. The Bengals obviously want to keep him around. There was talk of him being cut this offseason. They haven't even asked him to take any type of a pay cut at this point. He's the lead back without a whole lot of competition. Jamal Williams led the way by quite a margin in rushing touchdowns last year. But can he really sustain that going forward? We'll see here in just a second. And even though Austin Ekeler barely broke 200 carries this offseason, he was still at the top of the leaderboard for rushing touchdowns. This is a guy that's going to continue to get a ton of red zone work, and why I'm still drafting him high this season. It's crazy to see that Aaron Jones only had 2 rushing touchdowns last year. I'm going to say it right now, Headliner Nation, I guarantee that that's more in 2023. What about red zone carries and goal line carries? Well, I've talked about this with Jamal Williams already in the offseason. He led both of these categories, especially at the goal line, by a wide margin. But when you look at his red zone carries, Austin Ekeler was only 7 carries behind him. Again, this is a guy, when they get close down to the goal line, Ekeler doesn't come off the field. He's still getting those high priority touches. So even his volume is not exactly where you would want it to be for overall carries. He's getting some of the carries that matter the most. And I just mentioned it with Jamal Williams, tons of goal line carries last year, and it's one of the reasons why he had 17 rushing touchdowns. Only 3 of his rushing touchdowns came outside the red zone last year. He was scoring when the opportunity was given to him almost every single time. But right behind him, Dalvin Cook and Joe Mixon. All right. So once again, Dalvin Cook was not only getting you a lot of yards last season, he was getting you high priority touches as well. And Joe Mixon will likely still get those same high priority touches this season. Let's take a look at the passing game. And what about targets? Well, I think seeing Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler at the top is no surprise to anybody. But what about my boy Ramondre Stevenson? Stevenson had 87 targets in the passing game last year. And while that number might come down a little bit, that's okay because he has plenty of room to grow when it comes to just overall rushing attempts on the ground. So even if you don't think he's going to get 87 targets again, I still think realistically being in the 60, 65, 70 range is still there, and we know that his rushing attempts will go up too. What about total receptions? And to see Joe Mixon's name in 4th place is crazy because it has been a problem since he was drafted. He never has really gotten as much work in the passing game as we know that he could handle. And even though he was disappointing on the ground last season, his growth in the passing game is really something to consider this year. So while some of those RB5 like high upside years, which I am 100% guilty of saying he could have, are in the past, this is still a guy that, given his draft capital and how he was utilized in the passing game last year, could still see a great amount of volume this year and be a steal for you in drafts. Josh Jacobs went ham sandwich on the ground last year, but people really overlook what he did in the passing game. 8th in targets, 8th in receptions, 6th in receiving yards. Now, will he see some of that same work this season? Maybe not. But with a guy like Jimmy Garoppolo, who we know as, not the best when it goes to pushing the ball down the field, I have to imagine he's going to look to Jacobs quite a bit. Me personally, I think Jacobs could be in for another really big year. McCaffrey, Eckler, and Aaron Jones were tied with 5 receiving touchdowns each. And this is, again, another point to Aaron Jones, how good he is in the passing game. And last year was not a great year for him. But I really do think he bounces back. In fact, in my video the other day with NFL quarterback Kurt Benkert, who has been a backup in Green Bay behind Aaron Rodgers, even said it himself. He believes A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones will absolutely carry this offense. It will run through them this season. And I agree with him that Aaron Jones may be the biggest benefactor when it comes to fantasy performance. You might be saying, Kyle, what are we doing with all this information? Why did we get it all together? Well, we are going to average out their finishes in each category to find out who gave you the best volume numbers overall last year. McCaffrey, Eckler, and Jacobs leading the way probably does not surprise anybody. 2 of these 3 guys are going to be top 5 picks in your fantasy drafts this year. But is Josh Jacobs being overlooked? It is quite possible. If he even gets close to the same amount of volume he had last year, even if it's just a little bit of drop in production, he should still end up being a guy that gives you top 10 numbers at the position easy. We know Barkley and Henry get tons of volume, but to see Dalvin Cook make his way into the top 6 surprises a lot of people, I'm willing to bet, including myself. I forgot just how many touches he got last year. And was he uber productive like the Dalvin Cook that we've seen in the past? Absolutely not. But we know that running backs have a hard time keeping up with that type of volume over the course of several years. But we have to wait and see where he lands. If he stays in Minnesota, there's a reason for it. And they may have paid Alexander Mattison a decent backup contract, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's just going to take over starting duties if Dalvin Cook is still there. Mixon, Harris, and Stevenson are our next 3 on the list. And for Mixon, I think a lot of you are probably surprised he finishes here, but because he had such a nice uptick in his volume in the passing game, he absolutely still locked into the top 10 with the volume monsters. Najee Harris still got a lot of volume as well. Drop in production, but if he's healthy to begin the year and a better offensive line, that could change. And I think one of the biggest potential risers in this list has to be Ramondre Stevenson. This guy is still a top 5 running back for me in 2023. It probably shocks some of you to see Nick Chubb down here with Aaron Jones and Travis Etienne. But it's the same thing every season, ladies and gentlemen. He gets knocked in these categories because he doesn't do anything in the passing game. But I bet you when we take a look at running back efficiency next week, you won't care about these stats. Jones, I think, will have a huge bounce back this year, and Travis Etienne is continuing to fly under radars because people are worried about Tank Bigsby. Let's be honest, people. Travis Etienne is better than Tank Bigsby. And Tank can get a few more carries. That's absolutely fine. Travis Etienne is still going to be a stud. It might shock you that Jamal Williams was so low on this list. But when you're 7th in rushing attempts and only 10th in rushing yards and do absolutely nothing in the passing game, it's going to bring you down. Miles Sanders is very low. And again, even though he had a good volume-like season, there was a few things holding him back, especially what he did in the passing game. Alvin Kamara probably had his worst season since coming into the league, so he could bounce back, but all of it depends on whether or not he even plays this year. Kenneth Walker was all set to take over a lead back role, but then they drafted Zach Charbonnet. Does he stay in this area for 2023? Dameon Pierce would likely be higher on this list if he didn't miss the end of the 2022 season. So will the Houston Texans be careful with his workload this year? And then Brian Robinson is a popular breakout pick for a lot of people, but please don't forget Antonio Gibson is still there and we'll likely see passing down work over Brian Robinson. So if he's going to rise on this list, he's going to have to see a dramatic rise in his volume on the ground. Yo, Headliner Nation, hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here to the channel, and leave me a comment down below on which one of these names here you feel will either finish higher next season or lower next season. And of course, I appreciate y'all for tuning into the episode. Peace out, stay safe, and stay healthy, Headliner Nation. I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.